When Jacob Brenner started excavating a 14-foot pit behind his claim near Fort Benton, Montana Territory in October 1887, his neighbors assumed the German immigrant had finally lost his mind to the isolation. They watched him disappear into the earth day after day, emerging covered in clay and stone dust, muttering about thermal mass and air circulation. What they didn't know was that Brenner was preparing the only structure within 50 miles that would maintain human habitability when winter temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero. If this story of frontier ingenuity and thermal engineering interests you, consider subscribing to see how innovation triumphed over conventional wisdom in America's harshest environments. The Montana Territory of 1887 represented the collision point between industrial expansion and environmental extremity. The Great Northern Railway was pushing westward, bringing waves of homesteaders who filed claims on quarter sections of land that promised agricultural prosperity but delivered meteorological punishment. Fort Benton, positioned at the navigable head of the Missouri River, served as the supply terminus for mining camps, cattle ranches, and farming settlements scattered across the northern plains. The region's economy depended on wheat cultivation, cattle grazing, and freight hauling, all activities that required human endurance through winters that routinely saw temperatures drop to 20 below zero Fahrenheit, with occasional Arctic surges driving the mercury down to 40 below or colder. The accepted construction wisdom came from multiple sources, all converging on the same basic principle. Walls must be thick, solid, and above ground. The U.S. Department of Agriculture's Homesteader Guides recommended log cabins with walls at least 8 inches thick, chinked with mud and moss. The Army Corps of Engineers specifications for frontier outposts called for double-walled structures with sawdust insulation between inner and outer planking. Local builders, many from Scandinavian backgrounds, advocated for the stabber tradition. Heavy timber construction with sod roofing. Every manual, every experienced carpenter, every survival guide emphasized the same formula. More mass equals more protection. The standard homestead cabin measured 16 by 20 feet, constructed from lodgepole pine logs averaging 10 inches in diameter, with a single door, one small window, and a stone chimney rising 8 feet above the roof peak. These structures took 3 to 4 weeks to build with 2 men working full-time, consumed 8 to 12 cords of firewood per winter, and cost between $75 and $120 in materials and labor. The community trusted this wisdom because it came from centuries of Northern European experience, reinforced by government engineers and replicated across thousands of successful homesteads. When Jacob Brenner announced his intention to build something different, something underground, the response ranged from skepticism to outright mockery. Subscribe to this channel to discover more stories of innovation that challenged conventional thinking and transformed frontier survival. The winter of 1886-1887 had already demonstrated the inadequacy of standard construction methods, though few settlers wanted to acknowledge the lesson. The Miller family, occupying a claim 4 miles west of Brenner's property, had built their cabin according to every recommended specification. Walls of 12-inch diameter spruce logs, carefully chinked with a mixture of clay and prairie grass, a thick sod roof designed to provide additional insulation, and a massive stone fireplace that consumed an entire cord of wood every 4 days. The structure had cost Samuel Miller $135 and 42 days of labor, representing the accumulated advice of 3 experienced carpenters and the written guidance from 2 different homesteader manuals. The cabin failed its occupants systematically and measurably. Throughout January 1887, with exterior temperatures averaging -15 degrees Fahrenheit, the interior temperature 5 feet from the fireplace never exceeded 42 degrees. At the far wall, 16 feet from the heat source, the temperature remained consistently between 28 and 34 degrees, cold enough that water left in cups overnight developed ice crystals. The family burned through 7 cords of wood in January alone, requiring Samuel to spend 4 to 6 hours daily cutting, splitting, and hauling fuel. The children, ages 4, 7, and 9, developed persistent coughs from the combination of cold air and wood smoke that inadequate draft systems failed to evacuate properly. By February, gaps had appeared in the chinking as the clay mixture contracted in the extreme cold, creating drafts that made the temperature variance even worse. Margaret Miller, who kept meticulous household records, noted that she could not knead bread dough at the table because it would not rise in the cold, forcing her to work within 3 feet of the fireplace where flour and utensils had to be carefully guarded from sparks. The Johansson family, Swedish immigrants who had arrived 2 years earlier and built what locals considered the finest cabin in the district, experienced similar failures. Their structure featured double-wall construction with a 6-inch gap filled with sawdust insulation, exactly as recommended by Army engineers. The walls were 18 inches thick at the base. The roof carried 3 feet of sod, and the fireplace had been designed by a mason from Helena, who charged $40 for his expertise. Despite this engineering investment, interior temperatures during the coldest weeks of winter hovered between 35 and 45 degrees, requiring the family to wear full outdoor clothing inside their home. The sawdust insulation, which had cost $12 and taken 3 days to install, had settled and compressed, creating air gaps at the top of the wall cavity that allowed cold air to circulate down into the living space. Frost formed on the interior walls each night, and by morning, a thin sheet of ice covered the surfaces farthest from the fire. These were not poorly built structures. They represented the best available knowledge, executed by skilled hands with quality materials. Their failure was not one of craftsmanship, but of fundamental thermal design. The conventional approach assumed that mass alone could resist cold, that thick walls would prevent heat loss through simple bulk. This assumption ignored the actual mechanisms of thermal transfer, conduction through solid materials, convection through air movement, and radiation across empty space. Every log cabin, no matter how thick its walls, remained a heat-bleeding system that required constant energy input to maintain minimal habitability. Jakob Brenner had learned different principles in a different context, and he carried that knowledge to Montana, with the certainty of a man who had tested theory against reality and survived the examination. Jakob Brenner's education in thermal management had begun not in Montana, but in the iron mines of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where he had worked from 1878 to 1883 as a timbering assistant in shafts that descended 800 feet below the surface. The mines maintained a constant temperature of 54 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of surface conditions. In winter, miners descended from 20 below zero surface temperatures into relatively warm underground chambers. In summer, they left 90-degree heat to work in the cool depths. This temperature stability had nothing to do with heating systems or insulation materials. It resulted from the thermal mass of surrounding bedrock and the insulating properties of Earth itself. Brenner had observed that shallow workings, those within 30 feet of the surface, showed temperature variations corresponding to seasonal changes. Deeper workings remained stable. The transition depth, the point at which seasonal temperature swings ceased to penetrate, occurred at approximately 12 to 14 feet in most soil types. Below that depth, the Earth's temperature reflected the mean annual air temperature of the region, typically between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on latitude. This geothermal stability meant that any space excavated below the frost line existed in a naturally moderated environment, requiring far less energy to heat to comfortable levels than any above-ground structure. The second component of Brenner's knowledge came from his childhood in Bavaria, where his grandfather had maintained a root cellar that stayed above freezing through winters that killed livestock in barns. The cellar, dug 8 feet into a hillside and covered with 3 feet of earth, maintained temperatures between 35 and 45 degrees without any heat source. Vegetables, potatoes, and smoked meats stored there remained unfrozen and fresh. His grandfather had explained the principle in simple terms. Earth that does not freeze provides temperature, and still air trapped in layers provides insulation. The combination creates a thermal battery that neither overheats in summer nor freezes in winter. When Brenner filed his homestead claim in spring 1887, he arrived with specific knowledge that contradicted everything his neighbors believed about cold weather survival. His plan was not to build upward against the cold, but to descend below it, creating a dwelling space that existed in the Earth's naturally moderated thermal zone. He shared this plan with exactly 2 people: Samuel Miller, who laughed and suggested Brenner was confusing human habitation with potato storage, and Niels Johansson, who listened politely and then explained that every Norwegian and Swedish homesteader knew that earth-sheltered structures were appropriate only for temporary camps or storage, not for year-round family living. The consensus was clear: serious settlers built above ground. Only desperate men, lazy men, or crazy men dug holes to live in. Brenner began excavation in early October, giving himself 6 weeks before the ground would freeze too solid for digging. His neighbors, watching from a distance, saw a man wasting valuable construction time on an increasingly deep hole when he should have been raising walls and roof timbers. What they couldn't see was the precision of his work, the specific dimensions he was targeting, and the engineering logic that guided every shovel of removed earth. The excavation descended 14 feet below natural grade, reaching well past the frost penetration depth of 9 feet that characterized Montana soils. The floor plan measured 12 feet by 16 feet, slightly smaller than standard cabin dimensions but adequate for a family of 4. Brenner excavated in sections, carefully shoring the walls with timber frames to prevent collapse, removing approximately 268 cubic yards of earth over the course of 33 days. The pit's orientation ran east-west, with the entrance facing south to maximize passive solar gain during winter months. The structure that emerged from this excavation appeared, from ground level, to be nothing more than a low mound with a wooden door frame visible on the southern exposure. Neighbors who ventured close enough to inspect the work saw a crude timber framework supporting a roof of poles, branches, and canvas, all covered with the excavated earth piled 3 feet thick. The entrance descended via 6 rough-cut steps into darkness. To anyone familiar with standard construction, the entire project looked like a temporary dugout, the kind of primitive shelter that homesteaders occupied during their first desperate winter before building proper housing. The notion that Brenner intended this as his primary dwelling, that he planned to move his wife and 2 children into this underground space for the winter, struck most observers as either a sign of poverty so extreme he couldn't afford proper lumber, or delusion so complete he couldn't recognize the difference between a home and a grave. The skepticism was not entirely irrational. Earth-sheltered construction carried legitimate risks. Inadequate ventilation could lead to carbon dioxide buildup or carbon monoxide poisoning from heating fires. Moisture infiltration could create damp conditions that promoted respiratory disease. And structural collapse, while rare, remained a possibility if excavation walls were not properly supported. These concerns had historical precedent. Several mining camps in the Montana Territory had experienced fatalities in poorly ventilated dugout shelters during the 1870s. The conventional wisdom that prioritized above-ground construction with multiple windows and good air circulation had developed partly in response to these documented failures. But Brenner's design addressed these concerns through specific engineering choices that his neighbors, lacking his mining experience, failed to recognize. The structure was not simply a hole covered with dirt. It was a carefully planned thermal management system that used earth as both insulation and heat reservoir, that controlled air circulation through deliberate ventilation pathways, and that minimized heat loss through elimination of thermal bridging and convective drafts. What Brenner understood, and what his neighbors would learn only through measured comparison, was that the battle against extreme cold was not won through brute force, but through sophisticated control of heat transfer mechanisms. The philosophical divide between Brenner's approach and conventional frontier construction represented two fundamentally different understandings of thermal physics, even if the participants could not have articulated the distinction in those terms. The conventional method operated on an intuitive model. Cold is an attacking force that must be resisted through barriers of mass and density. Build thick walls, seal all gaps, maintain a large fire, and the interior space will remain warm through sheer defensive strength. This model treated heat and cold as substances that competed for occupation of interior space, with victory going to whichever side marshaled greater resources. Brenner's approach, derived from mining experience and Bavarian tradition, operated on a different principle. Heat is a flowing quantity that moves from warm areas to cold areas through specific mechanisms, and the goal of shelter design is not to resist this flow through mass, but to minimize it through intelligent barriers and to reduce the temperature difference that drives the flow in the first place. In modern thermodynamic language, which did not exist in common usage in 1887, Brenner was optimizing for reduced delta-T and minimized heat transfer coefficients. In his own vocabulary, he was seeking to trap stillness and borrow warmth from below. The key insight was that Earth, when positioned below the frost line, does not need to be heated from cold to warm. It already exists at a moderate temperature, typically 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit in Montana's latitude. A living space excavated into this zone starts each day not at the ambient air temperature of -20 degrees, requiring a 70-degree temperature lift to reach comfort, but at the Earth's stable 45 degrees, requiring only a 25-degree lift. This difference represented a potential energy savings of approximately 64% simply through choice of construction location. The second principle involved air movement. Conventional cabins with their gaps, drafts, and chimney-driven convection constantly exchanged interior warm air for exterior cold air. This exchange occurred not just through visible cracks, but through the natural draft created by the fireplace itself, which drew air into the structure at floor level and exhausted it through the chimney. A typical fireplace might exhaust 200 to 400 cubic feet of air per minute, all of which had to be replaced by exterior air drawn through every available gap in the structure. This meant that no matter how thick the walls, the actual heat retention of the space was limited by the rate of air exchange, which in poorly sealed cabins might completely replace interior air every 10 to 15 minutes. Brenner's design minimized air exchange through several mechanisms. First, the entrance descended through 6 steps, creating a cold air trap where denser cold air pooled below the living level, reducing infiltration into the main space. Second, the structure had only one opening to the exterior, eliminating cross-drafts. Third, the heating system used a small sheet metal stove with a pipe that ran horizontally for 6 feet through the interior space before turning up to exhaust through a single vent pipe, allowing the exhaust gases to transfer heat to the interior air before exiting. The stove, far smaller than the massive stone fireplaces in conventional cabins, burned only 1/10 the fuel, but operated in an environment where heat loss rates were dramatically reduced. The third principle involved thermal mass and radiation. Conventional log walls, despite their thickness, have relatively low thermal mass and high conductivity. A 12-inch log wall will conduct heat from the warm interior surface to the cold exterior surface continuously, creating a steady energy drain. Earth-sheltered walls, by contrast, are backed by essentially infinite thermal mass at a stable moderate temperature. Heat radiating from the interior space warms the earth immediately surrounding the living area, but this heat does not escape to the exterior. Instead, it creates a thermal buffer zone, a region of slightly elevated temperature that further reduces the temperature gradient between living space and surroundings. These principles, when combined, created a system that required fundamentally different amounts of energy to maintain habitable temperatures. A conventional cabin might require 300,000 BTUs per day to maintain 65 degrees interior temperature at -20 exterior temperature. Brenner's earth-sheltered design, starting from a baseline of 45 degrees and operating with minimal air exchange and reduced surface area exposed to cold, might require only 75,000 BTUs per day to achieve the same interior comfort level. This 4-to-1 efficiency difference meant that a family could survive a Montana winter on 1/4 the fuel, 1/4 the labor, and with dramatically improved comfort and health outcomes. But these principles, however sound in theory, required validation through measurement and comparison. The neighbors who laughed at Brenner's rat hole were not being unreasonable. They were being conventional. And convention, in frontier survival, carried the weight of accumulated experience and the safety of proven methods. To challenge convention required not just different ideas, but demonstrable results, recorded and witnessed, that could overcome the inertia of established practice. The first measurement of Brenner's system's performance came not from a planned experiment, but from simple necessity. By mid-November 1887, the structure was complete enough for occupancy, though exterior finishing work on the earth mounting remained incomplete. Temperatures had already dropped to 10 below zero during several night periods, and Brenner's frame house, where the family had been camping while construction progressed, was becoming uninhabitable. On November 18th, the Brenner family moved into the underground dwelling, carrying with them blankets, cooking equipment, basic furniture, and a spirit thermometer that Jakob had purchased from a surveyor's supply catalog for $3.50. The thermometer, a simple instrument consisting of an alcohol-filled glass tube marked in 5-degree increments from -40 to +120 degrees Fahrenheit, became the objective recorder of the underground shelter's thermal performance. Brenner mounted it on the earthen wall opposite the entrance, 5 feet above floor level, in a location that received no direct radiant heat from the stove, but reflected the general air temperature of the living space. Over the following 2 weeks, as exterior temperatures fluctuated between +5 degrees during midday and -18 degrees overnight, the interior thermometer showed remarkable stability. Morning readings consistently registered between 52 and 56 degrees before any fire was lit. Once the small sheet metal stove was burning, typically for 2 hours during breakfast preparation and 2 hours during evening meal preparation, the interior temperature rose to between 62 and 68 degrees and remained in that range for the entire day, dropping only 4 to 6 degrees overnight even with no fire burning. The fuel consumption proved equally remarkable. Brenner burned only 1/8 of a cord of wood per week, compared to the full cord per week being consumed by the Millers in their conventional cabin 4 miles west. Projected across the winter season, this represented a fuel requirement of approximately 2½ cords for the entire November through March period, compared to the 20 to 25 cords typically required for standard cabin heating. These results did not go entirely unnoticed. Martha Brenner, Jacob's wife, mentioned the shelter's warmth during a December visit to Fort Benton, where she had gone to purchase supplies. Her description of walking around the underground dwelling in a simple wool dress while exterior temperatures stood at 12 below zero prompted skeptical questions. When she mentioned that her husband was burning less than a cord of wood per month, one merchant accused her of outright fabrication. The general consensus held that she was either lying to hide some embarrassing situation or genuinely confused about measurements and temperatures. The skepticism broke slightly when Werner Schmidt, a German-born surveyor working for the Great Northern Railway, took a professional interest in the claims. Schmidt had training in engineering and access to precision instruments. In late December, he visited the Brenner property carrying a calibrated thermometer and a notebook. What he found challenged his own assumptions about shelter design and thermal efficiency. Schmidt's measurements, taken on December 28, 1887, with exterior temperature at -14 degrees Fahrenheit, showed interior temperatures of 64 degrees at the center of the living space, 60 degrees near the walls, and 58 degrees in the sleeping alcove farthest from the stove. He observed that the stove, a simple cast-iron box measuring 18 by 24 inches, burned approximately 4 pounds of split pine per hour, and had been operating for 1½ hours at the time of his visit. He noted the absence of drafts, the slight earthy smell of the interior air, and the complete absence of frost on any interior surface. The earth walls remained dry to the touch, showing no signs of moisture infiltration. Schmidt returned to the Brenner shelter 3 more times over the following month, taking measurements under varying exterior conditions. His written report, submitted to the railway company as part of a broader survey of homesteaders' survival capabilities, documented interior temperatures that never fell below 50 degrees, even when exterior temperatures reached -32 degrees, and fuel consumption rates that averaged 1/5 those of conventional structures. The report included Schmidt's professional assessment. The underground construction, while unconventional in appearance, demonstrates superior thermal efficiency through reduction of exposed surface area and utilization of Earth's inherent temperature stability. The design merits consideration for railway worker housing in extreme climate zones. This represented the first external, professionally documented validation of Brenner's approach. But validation by a visiting engineer was one thing. Acceptance by neighboring homesteaders who had invested their labor and capital in conventional construction was another matter entirely. The true test would come not from measurement under normal winter conditions, but from survival during abnormal ones, when the margin between adequate and inadequate preparation became the margin between life and death. To understand how Brenner's design achieved its thermal efficiency, one must examine the structure layer by layer, from the bedrock foundation upward through the earth mounding, identifying each component's function within the overall system. The design was not revolutionary in the sense of using unknown materials or unprecedented techniques. Its innovation lay in the systematic application of principles that individually were familiar to various building traditions, miners, and root-cellar builders, but which had never been combined into a year-round dwelling system optimized for extreme cold. The foundation level consisted of the excavated floor at 14 feet below natural grade. At this depth, the earth temperature remained stable at approximately 47 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, driven by geothermal heat flow from below and insulated from seasonal temperature swings by the 12 feet of soil above the frost penetration depth. Brenner had spread a 4-inch layer of coarse gravel across the floor to prevent direct contact between occupants and bare earth, improving drainage and reducing moisture transmission. This gravel layer cost nothing, having been hauled from a nearby creek bed, but served a crucial function in maintaining dry conditions inside the shelter. The walls consisted of exposed earth, cut vertically and supported at intervals by timber frames to prevent collapse. These walls were not lined with boards or fabric. They remained as bare earthen surfaces, which initially appeared crude but served important thermal functions. Earth has a thermal conductivity approximately 1/4 that of wood and 1/20 that of stone. A wall of earth 12 inches thick provides thermal resistance equivalent to a wooden wall 48 inches thick. Moreover, the earth wall was not truly 12 inches thick. It was backed by unlimited additional earth extending tens of feet in all directions, creating a thermal mass so large that it was effectively infinite compared to the heat flows within the living space. The ceiling structure consisted of 3 distinct layers, each serving a specific purpose. The primary structural layer used rough-cut timber beams spanning the 12-foot width, spaced at 2-foot intervals. These beams supported a secondary layer of smaller poles laid perpendicular across the beams, creating a framework that could bear the weight of earth above. The third layer consisted of canvas tarp, salvaged from a freighting company and purchased for $6. This canvas served as a moisture barrier, preventing water infiltration from the earth mounding above while remaining vapor permeable enough to prevent condensation buildup. Above the canvas, Brenner had placed a 6-inch layer of loose hay, which served as the primary insulation barrier. Hay, when kept dry, contains countless small air pockets that trap still air, providing excellent insulation at essentially no cost. The hay layer was covered by the excavated earth, piled 3 feet thick across the entire roof surface. This earth layer provided thermal mass, additional insulation, and protection for the hay layer from weather and animal disturbance. The entrance system demonstrated particular sophistication in its attention to airflow and thermal protection. The doorway opened to the south, allowing winter sun to provide passive heating during midday hours. The entrance descended via 6 steps cut into earth and lined with scrap lumber, creating a transitional zone 8 feet long between exterior and interior. This descent created a natural cold trap. Cold exterior air, being denser than warm interior air, would flow down the steps and pool at the bottom, while warmer interior air remained at the upper level of the living space. This arrangement meant that opening the door did not immediately exchange interior warm air for exterior cold air, as happened in conventional cabins. Instead, the cold air had to first displace the cold air already pooled in the entrance zone, significantly slowing the rate of heat loss during entry and exit. The ventilation system addressed the legitimate concern about air quality in an earth-sheltered space. Brenner installed 2 ventilation pipes, one near the floor level, which passively drew fresh air into the space through natural convection, and one at the ceiling level near the stove, which exhausted stale air and combustion products. The exhaust pipe ran through the earth mounding, where it transferred some of its heat to the surrounding soil before exiting at ground level. This arrangement ensured adequate fresh air without creating drafts or excessive heat loss, maintaining carbon dioxide levels within safe ranges while preserving thermal efficiency. The heating system centered on a small cast iron stove measuring 18 inches wide, 24 inches deep, and 16 inches tall. This stove, which Brenner had purchased used for $8, was approximately 1/6 the size of the stone fireplaces common in conventional cabins. Its small size was not a compromise but an intentional choice, matched to the reduced heating load of the earth-sheltered space. The stovepipe extended horizontally for 6 feet inside the living area before turning 90 degrees to exhaust vertically through the roof. This horizontal section transferred significant heat to the interior air, increasing the overall efficiency of the system. A conventional fireplace might have 15 to 20% efficiency, with most heat escaping up the chimney. Brenner's system, with its extended heat exchange surface and reduced draft requirements, likely achieved 40 to 50% efficiency, extracting far more usable heat from each pound of fuel burned. The thermal performance of this layered system could be understood through the concept of thermal resistance, or R-value, though this terminology would not become standard until decades later. The earth walls provided an R-value of approximately 10 to 12 per foot of thickness, but more importantly, they were backed by thermal mass at 47 degrees. The ceiling assembly, combining hay insulation and 3 feet of earth, provided an R-value of approximately 20 to 25, far exceeding the R8 to R10 typical of log cabin construction. The minimal air exchange rate, approximately 1/10 that of conventional structures, eliminated the largest heat loss mechanism that plagued above-ground dwellings. The result was a structure that existed in thermal equilibrium with its environment at a baseline temperature far above the exterior air temperature, requiring only modest energy input to reach comfortable living conditions. A conventional cabin was fighting to maintain a 70-degree temperature difference between interior and exterior. Brenner's shelter was maintaining only a 20-degree difference, and doing so with far less surface area exposed to heat loss. The physics was elegant, the execution was practical, and the results were measurable. What remained to be seen was whether these advantages would prove decisive when environmental conditions moved from merely harsh to genuinely life-threatening. The test came in January 1888, when a high-pressure Arctic system descended from Canada and stalled over the northern plains, bringing with it temperatures that broke records throughout the Montana Territory. The cold snap began on January 12th, with overnight temperatures dropping to -28 degrees Fahrenheit, which was severe but not unprecedented. Over the following 4 days, temperatures continued to fall. On January 16th, the thermometer in Fort Benton registered -36 degrees at dawn. On January 17th, it reached -42 degrees. On January 18th, the temperature fell to -46 degrees, and weather observers noted that the alcohol in their thermometers was approaching its freezing point of -114 degrees, making accurate measurement increasingly difficult. The cold was not merely extreme, it was sustained. For 7 consecutive days, from January 16th through January 22nd, daytime high temperatures never rose above -15 degrees. Nighttime lows remained between -38 and -46 degrees. The cold was accompanied by steady winds averaging 15 to 20 miles per hour, creating wind chill conditions that could cause frostbite in exposed skin within 2 minutes. Livestock froze standing in their enclosures. Water wells froze solid despite being dug below normal frost line. Railway operations stopped completely as metal became brittle, and steam engines could not maintain operating temperature. The conventional cabins scattered across the homesteading district began failing in cascades. The Miller family's cabin, which had seemed adequate during normal winter conditions, became a desperate trap during the extreme cold. With exterior temperatures at -42 degrees and interior temperatures falling to 18 degrees, despite a fire that consumed 1 full cord of wood in just 3 days, the family faced choices measured in hours of survival rather than days of comfort. Samuel Miller burned everything combustible, feeding the fireplace a continuous stream of split logs, fence posts, and eventually furniture, trying to maintain enough heat to prevent fatal hypothermia. The children huddled within 3 feet of the fireplace, wrapped in every blanket and coat the family owned, while Margaret Miller watched frost form on the interior walls and ceiling. The moisture from breathing and cooking freezing into crystalline sheets that grew thicker each hour. By the 4th day of extreme cold, the Miller family's wood supply was exhausted. Their food was frozen solid, and the interior temperature of their cabin had fallen to 12 degrees, despite burning the table, 2 chairs, and a bookshelf. Samuel Miller made the decision that saved their lives. They would abandon the cabin and walk the 4 miles to the Brenner property. The journey, made in -38-degree temperature, took nearly 3 hours with 2 adults carrying 2 children and dragging a sled with essential supplies. They arrived at Brenner's shelter with severe frostbite on hands and faces, exhausted and facing imminent hypothermia. The Brenner family's underground shelter performed exactly as its thermal design predicted. When the Millers descended the 6 steps into the earth-sheltered space, they entered an environment measuring 62 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained by a small fire that had consumed less than 1/4 cord of wood over the previous 4 days. The temperature contrast, from -38 exterior to +62 interior, represented a 100-degree difference that seemed impossible to people who had been fighting to maintain 40-degree interiors in conventional structures. The small cast-iron stove burned quietly in the corner, fed only twice daily with moderate amounts of split pine. The earth walls remained dry and frost-free. The air, while carrying a faint smell of earth and wood smoke, remained fresh due to the passive ventilation system that continued functioning regardless of exterior conditions. The Johansson family arrived the following day, having experienced similar failure in their double-walled cabin. Their structure, built with sawdust insulation and considered the finest conventional construction in the district, had maintained interior temperatures of only 22 degrees during the coldest nights, requiring round-the-clock fire tending that exhausted their wood supply and left them facing the choice between abandoning their home or risking death from hypothermia. They too walked to the Brenner shelter, arriving with 2 adults, 3 children, and severe exhaustion from maintaining fires continuously for 5 days, while sleeping in shifts to prevent the fire from dying and the temperature from falling below survivable levels. 3 additional families arrived over the next 2 days, driven from their conventional cabins by the simple mathematics of thermal failure. The earth-sheltered dwelling, designed for a family of 4, now housed 21 people in a space measuring 12 by 16 feet. The crowding was extreme, the privacy was non-existent, but the temperature remained stable. The small stove, now burning nearly continuously rather than twice daily, maintained interior temperatures between 58 and 64 degrees. Jakob Brenner's wood supply, which he had calculated would last his family through March, with normal heating requirements, was now being consumed at 4 times the planned rate. But this still represented only 1/4 the consumption rate of a conventional cabin, meaning that his stored supply could support the entire group for approximately 3 weeks even under maximum heating load. The failure of conventional structures was not limited to homesteader cabins. 2 miles north of Brenner's property, a Great Northern Railway section crew occupied a standard company-built bunkhouse designed to house 12 workers. The structure, built to railway specifications with double-wall construction and a large central stove, maintained interior temperatures of only 28 degrees during the coldest period, despite burning through the crew's entire 2-month wood supply in 1 week. The crew foreman, Peter Hansen, made the decision to relocate his men to the Brenner shelter after one worker developed symptoms of hypothermia despite being indoors with a fire burning. The operational challenge of housing and heating 30 people in a space designed for 4 required immediate organization and systematic management. Martha Brenner, who had experience managing field hospitals during a typhoid outbreak in her previous community in Wisconsin, implemented a rotation system that maximized space efficiency and maintained sanitary conditions. Sleeping occurred in 3 shifts, with adults rotating through 4-hour sleep periods while others remained awake, tending the fire, preparing food, and caring for children. The stove operated continuously, fed every 2 hours with split wood from Brenner's stockpile. Water was melted from snow brought down in buckets, rationed carefully to prevent waste. Food preparation occurred on a fixed schedule, with communal meals served twice daily. The most critical operational concern involved air quality. 30 people breathing and metabolizing in a relatively sealed space produced carbon dioxide, water vapor, and heat. The passive ventilation system, adequate for 4 occupants, needed supplementation. Jakob Brenner modified the intake vent, enlarging it to increase fresh air flow, and installed a second exhaust vent near the sleeping area. He monitored air quality by keeping a candle burning on a shelf near the ceiling. If the candle began to dim or flicker, it indicated rising carbon dioxide levels requiring immediate ventilation adjustment. This simple monitoring system, combined with the enlarged vents, maintained air quality within safe parameters throughout the occupation period. The medical challenges centered on frostbite treatment and prevention of respiratory infections. Martha Brenner organized a treatment protocol based on gradual rewarming of frozen tissues, careful monitoring for infection, and isolation of individuals showing signs of illness. The stable, moderate temperature of the shelter aided recovery significantly. Frostbite victims did not face the repeated freeze-thaw cycles that occurred in conventional cabins with their wide temperature swings. Respiratory infections, while a concern given the crowding, occurred at lower rates than expected, likely due to the absence of wood smoke irritation and the moderate humidity levels maintained by the earth wall's natural moisture buffering. The psychological dimension of the crisis proved as significant as the physical challenges. Families who had invested months of labor and significant capital in conventional cabin construction now occupied a shelter they had previously mocked as a rat hole and gopher den. The cognitive dissonance was substantial. Several individuals initially expressed reluctance to descend into the earth-sheltered space, preferring to return to their own cabins despite the obvious thermal failure of those structures. Only the immediate threat of death from hypothermia overcame this psychological resistance. Over the week-long occupation, as people experienced the consistent warmth, the stable conditions, and the minimal fuel consumption, the mockery transformed into grudging respect and then into genuine inquiry about construction methods and thermal principles. Jakob Brenner, who had endured months of ridicule for his unconventional design, did not gloat or lecture. He simply maintained the system, explained the principles when asked, and demonstrated through action rather than argument that his approach worked. When Peter Hansen, the railway foreman, asked direct questions about excavation depth, ceiling insulation, and ventilation design, Brenner provided specific answers, including measurements, material choices, and cost estimates. These conversations, held in a warm underground shelter while exterior temperatures remained below -30 degrees, carried a weight that no theoretical discussion could have achieved. The extreme cold broke on January 23rd, when westerly winds brought warmer air masses that raised temperatures to -5 degrees, then to +10 degrees over the following 2 days. The families began returning to their cabins, assessing damage, and planning repairs. But the experience had fundamentally altered perceptions about shelter design and thermal efficiency. What had been dismissed as eccentricity was now recognized as superior engineering. The question was no longer whether earth-sheltered construction was viable, but why anyone would continue building conventional structures that required 5 times the fuel and provided 1/3 the comfort. The data documenting the performance difference between conventional and earth-sheltered construction accumulated throughout the remainder of the winter and into the following spring. Werner Schmidt, the railway surveyor who had previously measured Brenner's shelter performance under normal conditions, returned in February to document the results of the extreme cold event. His report, submitted to the Great Northern Railway Company and subsequently published in the Helena Independent newspaper, provided statistical comparison that quantified the thermal advantage of earth-sheltered design. Schmidt's analysis compared fuel consumption, interior temperatures, and occupant health outcomes across 3 structure types: standard log cabins, improved double-wall construction, and Brenner's earth-sheltered dwelling. The data covered the period from November 1887 through March 1888, with particular focus on the January extreme cold event. Fuel consumption per degree day of heating requirement showed dramatic differences. Standard log cabins averaged 0, 42 cords of wood per 1,000 degree days. Improved double-wall cabins averaged 0, 31 cords per 1,000 degree days. The earth-sheltered dwelling averaged 0, 0.08 cords per 1,000 degree days, representing an 81% reduction compared to standard construction, and a 74% reduction compared to improved construction. Projected across a typical Montana winter with approximately 8,000 heating degree days, this translated to 3, 4 cords for standard cabins, 2, 5 cords for improved cabins, and 0, 64 cords for earth-sheltered construction. Interior temperature stability demonstrated equally significant differences. Standard cabins showed daily temperature swings of 25 to 35 degrees, from 48 degrees during peak fire periods to 13 degrees during overnight low fire periods. Improved cabins showed swings of 18 to 25 degrees. The earth-sheltered dwelling showed swings of only 8 to 12 degrees, maintaining a baseline of 52 degrees, even with no fire, and reaching 65 degrees with moderate heating. This stability had direct implications for human comfort, sleep quality, and the ability to perform normal domestic activities like cooking, washing, and child care. Health outcomes provided the most compelling evidence of performance differences. Schmidt's report documented respiratory infection rates, frostbite injuries, and cold-related illnesses across the homesteader population. Families living in standard cabins experienced respiratory infections at a rate of 2. 7 incidents per person over the winter period. Improved cabin residents showed 1 bite, 9 incidents per person. The Brenner family occupying the earth-sheltered dwelling throughout the winter experienced 0. 25 incidents per person, representing an 86% reduction compared to standard housing. Frostbite injuries showed similar patterns, with conventional cabin residents suffering minor frostbite during the extreme cold event, despite being indoors, while earth shelter residents remained injury-free. The economic analysis proved equally striking. The Miller family's standard cabin had cost $135 in materials and 42 days of labor to construct, and consumed approximately 23 cords of wood over the winter at a replacement cost, in labor time for cutting, splitting, and hauling, of approximately 128 days. The Brenner Earth Shelter had cost $42 in materials, primarily for the stove, canvas, and entrance lumber, and 33 days of excavation and construction labor, and consumed 2.1 cords of wood over the winter at a replacement cost of approximately 12 days of labor. The conventional cabin thus required 3 times the construction investment and 10 times the operational labor compared to the earth-sheltered alternative. These numbers, published in a newspaper with regional circulation and included in a railway company report that reached engineering offices in Minneapolis and Chicago, began transforming perceptions across a much wider audience than Brenner's immediate neighbors. The transformation was not instant, but it was measurable. By spring 1888, 3 homesteaders in the Fort Benton district had begun excavating earth-sheltered dwellings modeled on Brenner's design. By fall 1888, the number had increased to 11. The Great Northern Railway commissioned Brenner to supervise construction of 3 earth-sheltered bunkhouses for section crews along the High Line, paying him $30 per structure, plus materials costs. The conversion of former skeptics proved particularly notable. Samuel Miller, who had initially laughed at Brenner's rat hole and whose family had nearly died in their conventional cabin, spent April and May of 1888 excavating his own earth-sheltered dwelling. His structure, while following Brenner's basic principles, incorporated several improvements based on the extreme cold experience. A larger entrance vestibule to provide additional cold air trap volume, dual heating stoves positioned at opposite ends of the living space for more even temperature distribution, and a slightly shallower excavation depth of 12 feet rather than 14 feet, which reduced construction labor while still placing the floor well below frost penetration depth. Miller documented his construction process in a series of letters to his brother in Wisconsin, letters that were subsequently shared among farming communities throughout the upper Midwest and contributed to broader awareness of earth-sheltered construction techniques. Nils Johansson, the Swedish immigrant whose double-wall cabin had been considered the finest conventional construction in the district, also began an earth-sheltered project. His design incorporated Scandinavian turf-building traditions, creating a hybrid structure that combined excavation with stone foundation walls and a turf-covered timber roof. The result maintained the thermal advantages of earth contact while providing slightly more interior height and psychological separation from living in a hole, which remained a concern for some potential adopters. The interest extended beyond individual homesteaders. The U.S. Army, which operated Fort Assiniboine 60 miles east of Fort Benton, sent a quartermaster officer to inspect Brenner's shelter and interview him about construction methods. The military had experienced significant problems with troop morale and health during winter deployments in Montana, with conventional barracks requiring enormous amounts of fuel and still failing to maintain adequate warmth during extreme cold. The quartermaster's report recommended experimental construction of earth-sheltered quarters for cavalry units deployed to remote outposts, though this recommendation faced resistance from traditionalists who considered underground habitation unsuitable for military personnel. Commercial interests also responded to the documented performance advantages. Lumber dealers, initially hostile to earth-sheltered construction because it reduced lumber consumption, began offering winter shelter kits that included excavation tools, canvas sheeting, stovepipe, and simple instruction manuals based on Brenner's design. One entrepreneurial merchant in Helena, recognizing the potential market among miners and prospectors who worked in remote locations, advertised Bavarian winter dugouts. Stay warm on 1 cord per season. Complete plans, $2. While the quality of these commercial adaptations varied widely, their existence demonstrated that earth-sheltered construction had transitioned from eccentric experiment to recognized alternative within the regional building culture. The technical dissemination occurred through multiple channels: newspaper articles, railway reports, and word-of-mouth testimonials from families who had survived the January 1888 extreme cold in Brenner's shelter, all contributed to spreading knowledge. But perhaps the most effective teaching mechanism was simple observation. As earth-sheltered dwellings multiplied across the Fort Benton district during 1888 and 1889, neighbors could directly compare fuel consumption, observe smoke output from stovepipes, notice the absence of heavy wood-hauling labor, and see that families occupying these structures remained healthy and comfortable through winters that sent conventional cabin residents scrambling for additional fuel and warmer clothing. By the winter of 1889-1890, approximately 35 earth-sheltered dwellings operated within a 50-mile radius of Fort Benton. This represented roughly 12% of the homesteader population, a significant adoption rate for a technique that had been unknown in the region just 3 years earlier. The concentration was highest among recent immigrants from mining regions, Bavarian and Saxon Germans familiar with root cellar principles, and families who had experienced the 1888 extreme cold event personally. Resistance remained strongest among established homesteaders who had already invested heavily in conventional structures and among those from southern agricultural backgrounds who associated underground spaces with poverty or primitiveness. The spring thaw of 1888 revealed another advantage of earth-sheltered construction that had not been anticipated: moisture management. Conventional cabins, with their temperature differentials and poor vapor barriers, accumulated significant moisture damage over the winter. Interior condensation, driven by warm, moist air from cooking and breathing meeting cold wall surfaces, created ideal conditions for mold growth and wood rot. The Miller cabin showed extensive mold on interior log surfaces and deterioration of chinking that would require complete replacement before the following winter. The Johansson cabin, despite its superior construction, showed similar moisture damage, particularly along the junction between walls and ceiling, where condensation had been most severe. Brenner's earth-sheltered dwelling, by contrast, showed no moisture damage. The earth walls, with their natural moisture buffering capacity, absorbed excess humidity during cooking and released it gradually when interior air became drier. The temperature stability prevented condensation entirely, since no surface ever became cold enough for water vapor to condense. The canvas vapor barrier remained intact and functional. The structural timbers showed no signs of rot. The spring maintenance requirement consisted entirely of checking ventilation pipes for blockage and ensuring the earth mounding remained properly shaped for water drainage. Total maintenance time, approximately 4 hours. The Millers would spend an estimated 80 hours repairing and reconditioning their conventional cabin for the next winter season. These observations, while less dramatic than survival during extreme cold, contributed significantly to the practical case for earth-sheltered construction. Homesteaders operated on tight labor and capital budgets, a construction approach that required less initial investment, consumed less fuel during operation, and demanded minimal maintenance labor, represented a triple advantage that made economic sense regardless of any theoretical discussions about thermal physics or engineering principles. The technique was adopted not because it was innovative, but because it was demonstrably superior in measurable ways that directly affected survival, comfort, and prosperity. The winter of 1888-1889 brought another test, though not as extreme as the previous January. Temperatures fell to -35 degrees for 3 days in February, cold enough to challenge conventional structures, but well within the performance envelope that earth-sheltered dwellings had already demonstrated. The test this winter was not whether the technique worked, but whether it would continue to be adopted, or whether the previous year's extreme cold would be dismissed as a unique event unlikely to recur. The adoption continued. 7 additional earth-sheltered dwellings were constructed during the spring and summer of 1889. The Great Northern Railway built 4 more bunkhouses using the technique. 2 cattle ranches constructed earth-sheltered line cabins for winter pasture monitoring. The technique was diversifying beyond simple dwellings into specialized applications that leveraged the thermal advantages for specific purposes. One notable adaptation came from a dairy operation 15 miles south of Fort Benton. The owner, Emma Patterson, recognized that milk storage and butter production during winter required cool but non-freezing temperatures, exactly the thermal range that earth-sheltered spaces naturally maintained. She constructed an earth-sheltered dairy room measuring 8 by 12 feet, excavated 10 feet deep, with thick earth insulation and minimal heating. The space maintained temperatures between 38 and 45 degrees throughout the winter with no active heating, providing ideal conditions for milk storage and butter production, while requiring none of the ice harvest labor that conventional dairy operations needed for summer cooling. The butter produced in this facility won a quality award at the Montana Territorial Fair in 1890, and Patterson credited the consistent temperature control enabled by earth-sheltered construction as a key factor in achieving superior product quality. Medical applications emerged as well. A physician in Fort Benton, Dr. Harold Chen, who had trained in Boston and carried considerable skepticism about frontier construction methods, nonetheless recognized the potential of stable temperature spaces for patient recovery. He constructed a small earth-sheltered recovery ward adjacent to his conventional frame clinic, using the space for patients recovering from surgery, severe illness, or frostbite injuries. His medical notes documented faster recovery times and lower infection rates in the earth-sheltered ward compared to the conventional clinic space, attributing the difference primarily to temperature stability and reduced air exchange that limited pathogen circulation. These specialized applications demonstrated that earth-sheltered construction was not merely an alternative to conventional cabins, but a versatile technique applicable to any situation where thermal stability, fuel efficiency, and reduced maintenance labor provided advantage. The principle, once proven, could be adapted to multiple purposes beyond its original survival shelter context. By 1890, Jakob Brenner had become a recognized authority on earth-sheltered construction, receiving correspondence from homesteaders, railway engineers, and military planners requesting advice on design parameters, construction methods, and material choices. He responded to these inquiries with the same practical focus that had characterized his original design: specific measurements, clear explanations of thermal principles, and realistic cost estimates. He did not claim to have invented earth-sheltered construction, a technique with ancient precedents in multiple cultures. He simply demonstrated that it could be adapted to Montana conditions using available materials and labor, producing results superior to conventional methods in measurable ways. The broader significance of this story extends beyond one man's successful shelter design. It represents a case study in how innovation diffuses through populations, how conventional wisdom yields to measured evidence, and how extreme conditions accelerate the adoption of superior techniques by raising the cost of failure beyond acceptable thresholds. In moderate climates, conventional construction might be adequate despite its inefficiencies. In Montana's extreme environment, the difference between adequate and superior became the difference between survival and death, making the adoption of better methods not merely advantageous but necessary. 5 years after Jakob Brenner completed his first earth-sheltered dwelling, the landscape around Fort Benton bore visible evidence of the technique's adoption. Approximately 120 earth-sheltered structures operated within a 70-mile radius, representing a diverse array of applications: family dwellings, bunkhouses, storage facilities, dairy rooms, recovery wards, and line cabins. The technique had been documented in railway engineering reports, discussed in agricultural journals, and incorporated into revised homesteading guides that acknowledged earth-sheltered construction as a viable alternative to conventional cabin building. The transformation of regional building practice did not eliminate conventional above-ground structures. Many homesteaders continued building log cabins, particularly those in timbered areas where construction lumber was readily available, and those from cultural backgrounds that associated underground spaces with poverty or disfavor. The earth-sheltered technique remained one option among several, chosen by those who prioritized fuel efficiency and thermal stability over other considerations like interior height, window area, or social perception. But the technique's validation changed the calculation for all builders. Even those who chose conventional construction modified their designs in response to the principles Brenner had demonstrated. Cabins built after 1888 featured better sealing against drafts, more attention to ventilation management, and increased insulation in ceiling spaces. The competition from earth-sheltered construction, with its dramatic fuel efficiency, forced conventional builders to improve their performance or lose adopters to the alternative. The result was an overall improvement in frontier shelter quality, driven by the demonstration that superior performance was achievable using locally available materials and labor. Jakob Brenner himself continued living in his earth-sheltered dwelling through 1893, when he purchased a quarter section of better agricultural land 30 miles east and built a new structure incorporating lessons from 5 years of experience. His second design featured a hybrid approach: an earth-sheltered lower level for thermal efficiency, and a conventional frame upper level for living space, combining the advantages of both techniques. The design, while more complex and expensive than either pure approach, demonstrated continued evolution of the concept rather than rigid adherence to a single formula. The technical legacy of Brenner's work extended beyond individual structures or regional building practices. His earth-sheltered dwelling represented a concrete demonstration of principles that would eventually be formalized into building science: heat transfer mechanisms, thermal mass utilization, ventilation management, and moisture control. In 1887, these principles existed as scattered practical knowledge held by miners, root cellar builders, and traditional craftsmen. Brenner's contribution was not discovering these principles, but combining them systematically and documenting their performance in ways that allowed replication and further development. The final significance of this story rests not on the novelty of any particular technique, but on the validation process that transformed folk knowledge into accepted practice. When Brenner began excavating his rat hole in October 1887, he possessed knowledge that was individually correct but socially discounted. The conventional wisdom of thick walls and large fireplaces carried institutional weight. It appeared in official manuals, was recommended by experienced builders, and was embodied in thousands of existing structures. To challenge this consensus required not merely different ideas, but measured evidence, documented comparison, and dramatic demonstration during conditions where the stakes of being wrong were measured in frozen casualties rather than abstract inefficiencies. The January 1888 extreme cold event provided that demonstration. Conventional structures failed measurably and visibly, requiring fuel consumption that exceeded available supplies and producing interior temperatures that threatened occupant survival. The earth-sheltered dwelling performed exactly as its thermal design predicted, maintaining habitable conditions with minimal energy input. The contrast was not subtle or debatable. It was quantified in thermometer readings, fuel consumption records, and health outcomes. This empirical evidence, accumulated under conditions that made the difference between adequate and superior unmistakably clear, overcame the inertia of conventional wisdom and opened space for alternative approaches to be seriously considered. The lesson extends beyond shelter design to the broader dynamics of innovation in harsh environments. Extreme conditions create strong selection pressure against inadequacy, accelerating the adoption of superior techniques by raising failure costs beyond acceptable levels. Moderate environments tolerate inefficiency and allow conventional methods to persist, even when better alternatives exist, because the cost of switching exceeds the incremental benefit gained. But when temperatures fall to 40 below zero, and the difference between methods becomes the difference between survival and death, the calculus shifts decisively toward whatever works best, regardless of how unconventional it appears. Jakob Brenner's earth-sheltered dwelling succeeded not because it was innovative, but because it was thermally efficient, fuel efficient, and construction efficient in measurable ways that directly affected the survival and prosperity of people living in one of North America's most climatically challenging environments. The innovation was not in the materials or the individual techniques, but in their systematic combination, guided by understanding of heat transfer mechanisms. The walls were not thicker, they were smarter. The fuel consumption was not reduced through deprivation, but through elimination of unnecessary heat loss. The comfort was not a luxury, but an outcome of engineering that matched design to environment rather than forcing environment to accommodate inadequate design. This understanding, once demonstrated in a 14-foot excavation covered with 3 feet of earth on the Montana frontier in 1887, became available to anyone willing to examine evidence rather than convention, to measure performance rather than assume tradition, and to recognize that the best solution to surviving extreme cold was not fighting it with brute force, but understanding its mechanisms and designing systems that minimized energy requirements while maximizing thermal stability. The neighbors who laughed at Brenner's rat hole learned this lesson when they descended its 6 steps into warmth during 40 below zero temperatures and realized that the most effective shelter was not the one that looked most impressive from outside, but the one that kept you alive and comfortable inside while consuming the least resources and requiring the least labor. That lesson, purchased at the price of one man's willingness to be mocked for his unconventional approach, became legacy for everyone who came after and chose to build smarter rather than just bigger.